In this video, I want to cover the operation of the Australian safe harbours for copyright infringement. We'll cover three things in this video. First, I'll provide a brief overview of the legislative bargain that the safe harbours seek to achieve between the interests of rights holders and intermediaries. Second, we'll talk about the types of activities that the safe harbours protect. Third, we'll talk about the way that the safe harbours work by setting up a cap on liability. So the copyright safe harbours are a legislative bargain between the telecommunications industry and copyright owners. Telecommunications providers in particular were worried about their potential liability for the acts of their users. They don't know what their users are doing and they're reluctant to be liable when those users do infringe copyright using their networks. At this time, the extent of authorization or secondary liability for copyright infringement was much less clear than it is now. Even now, there's a lot of uncertainty about when intermediaries are liable for the acts of their users. So the safe harbours are designed for intermediaries to provide some certainty by providing a limitation on monetary penalties or monetary damages for suits of infringement of copyright. Copyright owners, on the other hand, sought protection for their rights online in two main ways. First, they look for a way to protect the digital rights management or DRM systems. These are systems that operate as electronic locks to ensure that devices are only playable or copyable on authorized devices. They also sought a regime called notice and takedown that would allow them to contact intermediaries to have infringing material removed from their networks. The industry groups were able to reach compromise, and the result was the legislative bargain that we see in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Those safe harbours were later exported around the world, including into Australia in 2004 as part of the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. It's important to note that the protection provided by the safe harbours are completely optional. An intermediary who wouldn't otherwise be liable for copyright infringement doesn't need to rely on the safe harbours to immunise them from liability. Therefore, the conditions that are contained in the safe harbours are only effective to the extent that an intermediary is already likely to be liable for infringing acts of their users. Logically, safe harbours apply only after copyright infringement has been found, which means that the obligations, for example, to terminate the accounts of repeat infringers will only apply to those intermediaries to whom copyright infringement can normally be attributed. The Australian safe harbours are modelled on the Digital Millennium Copyright Act from the United States, but they were redrafted into Australian law. This is quite important, so you'll notice some key legislative differences between the Australian scheme and the US scheme. First, the Australian scheme more explicitly separates out the different categories of service or conduct that the safe harbours tend to protect. But second, and most importantly, the Australian safe harbours are limited to carriage service providers as defined by the Telecommunications Act. This is a real difference and a big problem for Australian service providers because as defined, a CSP is essentially what we know as an internet service provider. This creates a massive problem for content hosts and search engines who are not internet service providers. These are the entities that routinely need to rely on the safe harbours under American law, but they are cut out expressly from being able to use the Australian safe harbours. This has caused a lot of tension over the last decade in Australia, where the telecommunications industry has complained that it's not able to offer new services within Australian borders. Search engines, content hosts, for example, face potential liability for the content that they host or make accessible over their networks, and they're not able to rely on the legislative bargain as we thought that they might be able to. This appears to be largely an oversight or a drafting error, but it's something that hasn't been fixed over the last 10 years. For those intermediaries that are able to rely on the safe harbours, there are four categories of behaviour that are protected by them. The first is transmission. This is what we think of as what an internet service provider does. It provides the pipes and facilities for people to access the internet. These providers don't exercise any control over what content travels over those pipes. They just provide the services for users. These are Category A service providers. Category B protects caching activities. This is when a service provider makes a local copy of content that is hosted on another network in order to make it faster and cheaper to communicate that content to its users. The third category, Category C, is for content hosts. This is a safe harbor that provides a limitation of liability for those who host content on behalf of others. So this could be website hosts, for example, or the operators of social networks. All of these provide facilities for people to make material available online. The safe harbor ensures that they are not liable when that material turns out to be infringing under certain circumstances. This would normally be perhaps the most important safe harbor, but because the way the Australian safe harbors are drafted excludes non-ISPs, non-carriage service providers in the legislation's terms, this means that many of the content hosts that we would think would be able to rely and would want to rely on the safe harbors are not able to. This explains to a large extent why large US intermediaries are reluctant to operate or offer services in Australia, because they could be liable for the content that they host here. The final category, Category D, protects the activities of search engines when they make material available through their index. In the case that a search engine is liable for linking to infringing content, the safe harbors provide protection for that. The safe harbor scheme was enacted quite early on in the internet, when the bounds of intermediary liability weren't quite so clear as they are now. So some of these safe harbors are very rarely used because the internet service provider is not actually liable in the first instance for copyright infringing acts of its users. Remember that the safe harbors are strictly voluntary. They only apply if an intermediary chooses to follow the restrictions, and the intermediaries only choose to follow the restrictions in cases where they would otherwise be liable for infringement. So the conditions imposed by the safe harbors do not apply in circumstances where there is no copyright liability to begin with. So the way that the safe harbors work is that if an intermediary is liable or likely to be liable for copyright infringement, they can follow the conditions set out in the safe harbor scheme and enact certain provisions that ensures that they will be immune from potential monetary damages in any future copyright suit. As part of the bargain, this doesn't completely immunize intermediaries. Even though a court may not order monetary relief, courts may still order injunctive relief. And this is important for copyright owners to be able to get a remedy that requires, for example, an intermediary to remove infringing content from their hosted network. In order to benefit from the safe harbors, intermediaries must follow all of the conditions that are listed in the legislation. The most important of these is the notice and takedown scheme that applies to Category C hosting activities. The notice and takedown regime provides a fast and efficient way for hosting intermediaries to respond to allegations of infringing content on their network made by copyright owners. Only if an intermediary complies with all the obligations of the safe harbor can they rely on its protection.